Good evening, and welcome to your daily news briefing. It's Thursday, June 18, 2026. I'm glad you're with me tonight, because we have a lot to get through: a major diplomatic showdown over the Iran deal, Ukraine striking Moscow in an unprecedented drone attack, a stunning reversal at ICE, a flu outbreak tied to a vaccine policy change, and much more. Plus, New York City had itself a day. Let's get into it. We're going to start in Washington, because the fallout from President Trump's preliminary deal with Iran is now front and center, and it is messy. Vice President J.D. Vance held a news conference at the White House today to push back against a wave of criticism that's been building from multiple directions at once. Here's the situation: Trump's deal with Iran is drawing fire from Israeli officials, who are calling it a disaster. Gulf states are frustrated that it doesn't address Iran's missile arsenal. And some Republicans on Capitol Hill are saying the deal gives Iran too much economic relief upfront while demanding very little in return, at least for now. So Vance stepped up to defend it. He pointed to falling gas prices, and they have fallen, with the average U.S. price dipping below $4 a gallon for the first time in months. He argued that the United States retains significant leverage over Iran going forward. And then he delivered what can only be described as an extraordinary warning to Israeli leaders who have been publicly criticizing the president. Vance described Trump as, and I'm quoting here, the only head of state in the entire world sympathetic to Israel, and warned Israel's leaders, "I might not be attacking the only powerful ally that I have." That's a pointed message from the number two in the U.S. government to a country that considers itself America's closest partner in the region. Shortly after Vance spoke, Iran's supreme leader weighed in for the first time on the preliminary deal. His tone was anything but conciliatory. He said that Trump had agreed to the terms, his words out of desperation, and he promised that Iran would not submit to what he called excessive demands during the next 60 days of talks. And Iran announced something else that caught attention: commercial ships wanting to pass through the Strait of Hormuz will now need to submit requests to a new agency called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority. That's a new layer of Iranian control over one of the world's most critical shipping corridors. Now, why does any of this matter? Because the Strait of Hormuz is how roughly 20% of global seaborne jet fuel exports move. This war effectively closed that strait for months, and it sent fuel prices skyrocketing. The preliminary deal is supposed to reopen it, and that's why gas prices have already started to move. But the new requirement to submit requests to an Iranian authority raises real questions about how open that strait is actually going to be. Let's talk about what's in the deal itself, because there's been a lot of confusion. According to the framework, Iran has agreed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz to free passage for 60 days, and to destroy its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. The United States in return is lifting its naval blockade of Iranian ports and granting Iran waivers to export oil before a final nuclear agreement is negotiated. That last piece is significant: it gives Iran an immediate economic lifeline. Iran's economy has been in serious trouble for years, with a collapsing currency and sky-high inflation. Oil revenues will help shore that up. Critics are focused on exactly that point. One former U.S. Treasury official described the oil sales clause as cracking, quote, the core architecture of U.S. oil and financial sanctions against Iran. The deal's defenders, including Vance, argue that Iran only gets the full economic benefits if it fundamentally transforms its behavior, including ending support for groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. Do they actually think we're going to release sanctions on the Iranian system if they're still funding a terrorist organization? Vance said in an interview with New York Times opinion columnist Ross Douthat today. We'll come back to that conversation in a moment. But first, Israel. The reaction there has been striking. Israeli officials see this deal as failing on every one of their stated war aims. Iran's government remains in place, actually described by analysts as more hardline and emboldened than before the war. The deal does nothing about Iran's missile arsenal or its support for Hezbollah and Hamas. And critically, the nuclear question, the issue at the very heart of why Israel wanted this war in the first place, has been pushed to a later round of talks. As one former Israeli security official put it, it's a bad agreement in which the Americans are paying with cash, and got, at the maximum, a letter of intent. One Israeli analyst for Channel 12 compared it to a, quote, diplomatic October 7, a reference to the Hamas attacks of 2023, calling it a cataclysmic surprise for which Israel was wholly unprepared. Prime Minister Netanyahu addressed the deal only briefly today, saying additional challenges lie ahead and vowing that Iran would not have nuclear weapons. He also said Israel would not withdraw from its security zone in southern Lebanon as long as security needs require it, a direct pushback against a deal provision that reportedly calls for Israel to pull back from Lebanon. Now, Vance also gave an extended interview today to Times opinion columnist Ross Douthat, a conversation that covered the Iran deal, but also Vance's faith, his new book about his return to Catholicism, and some genuinely striking moments. Vance pushed back on the idea that the deal favors Iran, pointing to what he described as a key difference from the Obama-era nuclear agreement: the destruction of Iran's existing stockpile of enriched uranium. Under the Obama deal, Iran was allowed to continue stockpiling enriched material. Under this one, that stockpile is supposed to be destroyed. He also noted that Iran's conventional military and nuclear program are, in his words, largely destroyed right now. Douthat pressed him on whether he had personally opposed the war before it began. Reporting has suggested he did, and Vance deflected somewhat, saying he provides his honest counsel to the president in private and then supports the president's decisions in public. He did confirm he has spoken with Pope Francis in recent months. The two have had a publicly complicated relationship over the war, but declined to characterize those conversations. On the matter of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, he was in Brussels today for a NATO meeting, and he did not hold back. Hegseth berated NATO allies as shameful for their reluctance to allow American jets and ships to use European bases during strikes on Iran. Several countries, France, Italy, Spain, either refused access or placed limits on U.S. operations. Hegseth said those decisions put American lives at risk. He also announced a 6-month review of the U.S. troop presence in Europe, and suggested the Pentagon would reduce what it pays in annual NATO dues if allies don't increase their defense spending as Trump has demanded. The U.S. currently pays about 15% of annual NATO administrative costs, roughly $790 million a year. NATO's Secretary General, Mark Rutte, tried to smooth things over publicly, but the friction was hard to miss. One more thing on the Iran deal you'll want to know: don't expect your airline tickets to get cheaper anytime soon, even if fuel prices drop. Aviation analysts say jet fuel costs may not decline significantly for months, because it takes time to restart wells, refineries, and supply chains. And even when costs do fall, airlines have noticed that customers are still willing to pay higher fares, so there's not much incentive to lower prices. U.S. airfares are currently about 28% higher than a year ago for domestic flights, and about 18% higher for international. Analysts say meaningful fare reductions probably won't come until travel demand softens in the fall or winter. Now let's move to what happened in Russia today, because the images are dramatic. Ukraine launched what appears to be the largest drone attack on Moscow since the war began. An oil refinery was hit, and it burned for hours. Toxic black smoke filled the sky over the city. Moscow's 4 airports were urgently shut down and stayed closed for most of the morning before gradually reopening. Part of the highway that rings the Russian capital was also closed. Ukraine's President Zelensky was direct about the message: if Ukraine burns, then your Moscow will burn as well. He framed the attack as a response to a Russian strike earlier this week on a monastery complex in Kiev that is one of the holiest sites in Eastern Orthodox Christianity. The scale was staggering. Russia's defense ministry said it downed 992 drones nationwide during the attack, the largest number in a single attack in the war. That alone tells you something about the size of the assault. The refinery that was hit supplies roughly 40% of Moscow's gasoline needs. Combined with weeks of Ukrainian drone strikes on oil facilities across Russia, the country is already seeing fuel rationing and long lines at gas stations in dozens of regions. The strikes are significant not just militarily, but psychologically. For most of this war, the Kremlin has been able to keep the conflict at a remove for most Russians. People in Moscow have gone about their lives largely insulated from the day-to-day terror that Ukrainians have faced. Today's strikes challenged that insulation directly. One Moscow resident told The Times he could see smoke from his house 4 miles away and heard what sounded like small explosions for hours. He said neighbors were spooked but struggling to connect what was happening to Russia's own aggression. It's like they were told for a long time not to look up, he said, and now it's as if they have lifted their heads for the first time. Hardliners in Russia responded with predictable fury, calling on Putin to unleash the country's full military capabilities. That raises the prospect of a new cycle of escalation, one that could extend well beyond the battlefield. Putin himself did not address the attacks during remarks at a regional summit Thursday afternoon, and Russian state media tried to minimize the story. Shifting now to domestic news, and a significant reversal out of the Trump administration. ICE Immigration and Customs Enforcement spent about $1 billion buying 11 large warehouses across the country as part of an ambitious plan to supercharge the deportation campaign. The idea was to massively expand detention capacity so that more people could be processed and removed quickly. It was a signature project under former Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. Now, the agency is planning to give away or sell 7 of those 11 warehouses, which cost more than $700 million. The reversal reflects the direction of the new Homeland Security Secretary, Markwayne Mullin, who had privately expressed skepticism about the plan. The department said it wants to focus on moving deportees quickly rather than housing them on American soil. The warehouses ran into serious problems almost immediately. Local communities, including in conservative areas, pushed back hard, worrying about the impact on local utilities and the economy. Environmental lawsuits piled up because ICE hadn't conducted required reviews of the impact on local environments. A federal judge blocked work on the Maryland facility entirely. The department's inspector general launched an investigation into the purchases. Some of the sites cost more than $145 million each, before any renovations. The 4 warehouses ICE plans to keep are in San Antonio and Socorro, Texas, Surprise, Arizona, and Hagerstown, Maryland, though, again, the Maryland one is currently blocked by a court order. On the health front tonight, a flu outbreak at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas has sickened nearly 160 troops, and the timing is drawing attention because it comes less than 2 months after Defense Secretary Hegseth made flu vaccinations optional for the military. Hegseth dropped the long-standing mandatory flu vaccine requirement in April, framing it as a matter of religious freedom and medical autonomy. Since then, only about 40% of Air Force trainees at the base have opted to get the vaccine. The outbreak tore through the basic training wing, where new recruits sleep in open bays and share communal meals, exactly the kind of environment where infectious disease spreads quickly. A trainee named Kian McDaniel died after falling ill on Friday, though the Air Force says it's still investigating whether his death was related to the flu outbreak specifically. In the aftermath, the Air Force issued an exception to the voluntary policy and is now requiring all recruits at Lackland to get flu shots. Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi, a Republican and Air Force veteran who chairs the Armed Services Committee, had warned when the policy changed that the vaccine requirement existed to enhance readiness. "You do give up certain rights when you take the oath," he said. Today's outbreak is raising those concerns again. Here's a health story of a different kind. There is a thriving black market for a weight loss drug called retatrutide, and it's growing fast. Retatrutide is being developed by Eli Lilly and is considered the most powerful weight loss drug currently in development. It's not expected to be approved by the FDA before next year, at the earliest. The FDA has warned people not to take anything that claims to be the drug. But that hasn't stopped a significant number of people from buying what they believe to be retatrutide from WhatsApp groups, Chinese labs, and websites that sell it for research purposes only, a legal loophole. Influencers are advertising it using code words. Ratatouille is a common one, a nod to the drug's name. Some sellers operate Telegram channels with over 1,000 members, selling vials for Bitcoin. The risks are real. There's no guarantee the substance in those vials is actually retatrutide, or that it's sterile or correctly dosed. The FDA's database shows 40 people have reported adverse reactions since 2024, including cardiac issues and hospitalization. But for people who feel they can't afford to wait or who couldn't get into a clinical trial, the black market has become an option they're choosing anyway. A few other stories moving fast tonight. The Supreme Court narrowed a federal law that had banned drug users from owning guns, siding with a marijuana user from Texas who challenged it on Second Amendment grounds. The justices ruled unanimously on the outcome, finding that the law was too broad in sweeping together occasional recreational drug users and people actually addicted to drugs who might pose a public safety risk. The ruling was written by Justice Neil Gorsuch and leaves the door open for Congress to craft more targeted legislation. Notably, this is the same statute used to convict Hunter Biden in 2024, though the court clarified the ruling doesn't affect the portion of the law that addresses addiction specifically. In Chicago, the Obama Presidential Center officially opened today with a star-studded ceremony. 4 former presidents were on stage together: George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, and Barack Obama himself. Bruce Springsteen performed. So did Christina Aguilera and The Roots. Michelle Obama gave a speech drawing a pointed implicit contrast with the current administration, saying her husband had done the job with such grace and class and cool. President Trump was not invited. He had compared the center to a trash heap. The $85 million campus on Chicago's South Side includes a museum, playground, public library, and sledding hill. It's the culmination of more than a decade of planning, legal battles, and construction. In England, the Church of England issued a formal apology today for its role in the decades-long practice of forced adoptions. From the 1950s through the 1970s, tens of thousands of unmarried pregnant women and girls in England and Wales were sent to institutions run by the church where their babies were taken from them. The church says it was involved in potentially more than 200 such facilities during that period, and that an estimated 185,000 babies were taken from unmarried mothers in England and Wales overall during those decades. The Archbishop of Canterbury said today, "The shame you were made to feel was wrong. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Rather, we are deeply ashamed that this happened to people in the care of Christian communities." The British government has also signaled it will issue its own apology soon. In Washington, D.C., a Democratic socialist has won the Democratic mayoral primary and is almost certain to become the city's next mayor. Janice Lewis George, a 38-year-old city councilwoman, won with about 53% of the vote, enough for an outright win without even going through the ranked choice counting process. In an overwhelmingly Democratic city, winning the primary is essentially winning the election. President Trump had threatened during the campaign to tighten federal control over D.C. if Lewis George won, saying maybe we take back Washington and run it on a federal basis. She told supporters his opposition was essentially a campaign ad. "Voters told her," she said, "if Trump doesn't like you, I love you." On the education beat, a troubling look tonight at how AI-assisted cheating has become effectively undetectable in many schools. Tools called humanizers rewrite AI-generated text to make it sound more natural. Tools called autotypers slowly drip text into documents over time, making it appear as though a student actually typed an essay word by word, complete with fake typos and revisions. Both tools are being openly marketed to students on TikTok and YouTube, sometimes by influencers who are paid partners of the companies but don't always disclose that. The companies making these tools often encourage responsible use while simultaneously building features that make cheating easier. Some of the same companies selling AI detection software to schools are also selling AI writing tools to students. Educators are struggling to keep up, and some analysts are simply saying the detection arms race is a dead end. In climate news, Western Europe is bracing for another severe heat wave just 2 weeks after one that broke records across the region. Temperatures are forecast to reach as high as 113 degrees Fahrenheit by the weekend, with much of France, Germany, Italy, and Switzerland under extreme heat warnings. This comes after an already unusually hot May, and most homes and hotels in Western Europe still don't have air conditioning. And the Trump administration has reversed course on its plan to dismantle a $368 million ocean monitoring system that scientists use to study climate change, coastal flooding, and marine heat waves. The National Science Foundation had already begun pulling some instruments out of the water off Oregon and Washington state, but following a bipartisan Senate measure and significant pushback, the agency announced it will pause all further removal and convene an expert panel to decide the system's future. Now here's a story that is both heartbreaking and, in its own way, a testament to human resilience. On Sunday, a plane carrying 12 people crashed at a skydiving drop zone in Butler, Missouri. All 12 were killed, including 11 passengers and the pilot. One of those passengers was a skydiving videographer named Dustin McKinney, who had been filming other jumpers that day. Lacey Reynolds had been jumping at the same drop zone that day. She and her group had just landed from a jump when McKinney's plane took off for the next run. Moments later, she heard what she described as a great, thunderous thud. She ran toward the runway and found the plane already on the ground and on fire. She got as close as she could. It was too hot to get closer. Reynolds knew 10 of the 12 people on board. She spent hours afterward talking to investigators, visiting the families of the victims, and sitting with stunned fellow skydivers at a nearby bar. And then, that same evening, she made a decision. She went back to a different drop zone and jumped. She explained why. In skydiving, people say that the longer you stay on the ground after a traumatic experience, the more you'll talk yourself out of ever going up again. "I don't do it because I have a death wish," she said. "I do it because I love it." The crash has renewed scrutiny of safety regulations for skydiving aircraft, which operate under less stringent rules than commercial charter flights. The National Transportation Safety Board has been raising alarms about this since at least 2008. A couple of fascinating items from the world of science and nature before we wind things down. British archaeologists announced Thursday they believe they've found an ancient site near Stonehenge, just 3 miles away in a village called Bulford, that was used for solstice rituals approximately 5,000 years ago. That's roughly 500 years before the famous stones at Stonehenge were even erected. Researchers found 2 pits they believe held wooden poles that formed a line pointing toward the sun during the solstices. They also found extensive evidence of feasting, pottery, animal bone, charcoal. The summer solstice is just days away, and thousands are expected to gather at Stonehenge to celebrate it. And in sadder natural history news, the major oak in Sherwood Forest, England's famous tree associated with Robin Hood, has died. The tree was between 800 and 1200 years old. It stood through the Black Death, through the Wars of the Roses, through 6 King Henrys and 6 King George. Its twisted trunk measured 36 feet in circumference at its widest. What killed it? A combination of factors: the compacted soil from millions of tourists, misguided past efforts to save it using iron rods, lead sheets, and even concrete, and climate change bringing record heat waves the weakened tree couldn't withstand. People are still expected to visit the tree even in death. As one man who leads Robin Hood tours in the forest put it, it will still cast a shadow over the woodland floor. Now, let's talk about something that made New York City feel like itself again today, and maybe made you feel a little better about the world. The New York Knicks had their championship parade through the Canyon of Heroes in Lower Manhattan, and the city absolutely lost its mind. This was the Knicks' first championship in 53 years. 53 years. And New Yorkers responded in kind. People were in line along Broadway before dawn. Some paid hundreds of dollars to have strangers save their spots. Others climbed scaffolding, sanitation trucks, traffic lights, and subway entrances to get a better view. There were an estimated 2,500 pounds of confetti. Mayor Zoran Mamdani, who has made no secret of his basketball fandom, threw t-shirts into the crowd and handed the team the keys to the city. Spike Lee, Timothée Chalamet, and Ben Stiller were all there. Finals MVP Jalen Brunson rode down Broadway leaning casually on the championship trophy. Karl Anthony Towns carried it into City Hall. There was a notable moment when owner James Dolan took the stage and got booed, a reminder that championships don't erase everything, but for most of the morning, the vibe was pure joy. One civil rights lawyer who has been a Knicks fan his whole life said he'd never seen anything like it. There's no resentment in this. It's just pure admiration. Pure heart and soul. As a note of what comes next, the Knicks have accepted a White House invitation. They'll become the first NBA team to visit the White House during the Trump presidency. A quick note for podcast listeners: Serial Productions, the team that brought you Serial in S-Town, released a new show today. It's called The Last 12 Weeks, and it follows a team of Capitol defense lawyers trying to stop the execution of a man on death row in Texas named David Wood, who was convicted in 1992 of murdering several young women and girls. The podcast covers the final 12 weeks before his scheduled execution date. It's produced in collaboration with the Marshall Project and is available wherever you get podcasts. And finally, tonight's lighter note: if you're ever driving through Ohio on State Route 16 near Newark, you might notice a 7-story building that looks exactly like a wicker basket, complete with giant arched handles. That is the former headquarters of the Longaberger Basket Company, built in 1997 because the founder wanted his office to look exactly like one of his products. Not inspired by a basket. Not reminiscent of a basket. An actual giant basket. It's 180,000 square feet, it sits on 21.5 acres, and the handles are heated in winter so that icicles don't crash through the glass atrium below. The building has been vacant for several years, and it is now on the market for $8.5 million. The current owner has one condition for any buyer: the building must stay a basket. Someone made him an offer and wanted to remove the handles. He said no. Hard no. That's your evening. A lot happened today, from the fragile new diplomatic landscape in the Middle East to a historic parade in Lower Manhattan, from a dramatic drone attack on Moscow to a championship tree's quiet death in an English forest. The world is a complicated place, but you've now got a map for today's version of it. We will be off tomorrow in observance of Juneteenth. Enjoy the long weekend. We'll be back on Monday.